Welcome to the Boy of the Moon podcast. My name is Hannah. Sorry about the new intro. It's kind of abrupt. Unfortunately, I was cleaning my computer of old files and my intro got deleted. So, anyway, we're not talking about my new intro today. We're going to be talking about the titular Oscar-nominated The Substance. And so, this movie... this is probably going to be a short podcast because I'm not going to go through all the beats of the movie. I'm just going to let you guys know the general gist of it is, the spoiler-free stuff. Demi Moore plays Elizabeth Sparkles, and she is this Hollywood actress who has her own fitness show. And when she hits 50, she gets fired. And it's because of her aging. And so she then goes to the doctor, and the nurse there gives her a USB chip card, whatever you want to call them. And she goes and plugs that into her computer, and it's for this thing called the substance. Now, what the substance does is you inject it into your body, the activator, and then it will create a separate you. And this separate you is the more perfect version of you, a better version of you. And so every 7 days, you switch between yourself and this perfect version of yourself. And the reason it has to happen every 7 days is because your spinal fluid, you, the Matrix, the original, your spinal fluid is what keeps the other version of you active and able to be active. But in order for that spinal fluid to be available for that other you have to be you for a bit to regenerate that spinal fluid. Like, your original body has to be active for 7 days to regenerate enough spinal fluid that your new version of you is good and fine and perfect, and the older version of you does not get any, doesn't get any worse than you are. And I say it like that specifically because this movie is about, it's really about aging. And I think too, one of my favorite contexts of this movie is just, you have these characters that are the males in the movie, like Dennis Quaid, Dennis Quaid, he's running around frolicking, able to age fine without any judgment or losing his position or anything like that. And same with the men around him. They're all older men, these executives. And it's because this world is really, it doesn't adhere to reality. It's more about, if we allow the male gaze to be the main gaze, where does that leave women? And so it's not a great place. And I think that that's very interesting. So if you're gonna watch this movie, first know it's a lot of body horror. I went and saw it with my mom, and my mom is not a horror person. She was able to sit through the movie perfectly fine. There's a lot of nudity in it, and it's not like, it's crazy because when Sue is wearing clothes and she's doing her pump it up stuff, she is more evocative and sexualized than when she's completely naked, which is crazy. But there is nudity in this. I would not want to see it with my dad, who I usually watch horror movies with. It was nice that I got to see it with my mom, and she was like, I think you had more trouble than I did, because for me, needles are terrifying, and there's a lot of needles happening, a lot of medical trauma kind of type stuff. So if that is really like where you draw the line, this is not a movie for you. I also want to let you know that this movie is actually kind of ridiculous. And I mean that in a most loving and wonderful way. At the climax of the movie, I was laughing hysterically, just cackling in this theater. And it was me and my mom and an elder couple. And the woman turned to the man I'd been cackling for at least 20 seconds at this point. I mean, the climax, it does this thing, and it does it for a good minute, maybe. And I was cackling and just laughing so hysterically. I'm like crying in this theater. And the lady turns to the man, and she says, the lady in the theater with us, she turns to her man that's there, and she says, "This has got to be the most ridiculous movie I have ever seen in my life." And that just made it like 30 times worse for me. I just started laughing even harder. But it's a really good movie. I very much enjoyed it. But a lot of the purpose of this podcast is to kind of forewarn people about what lies within a horror movie. And so, and a little bit to talk about the themes and why the movies themselves should be kind of allowed to exist, or why they shouldn't have been made. I have yet to make a podcast like that, but I'm sure one day I will. However, I think this movie really is, I think it knocks it out of the park. It has its own special tone. And a lot of it, like, as much as I'm, like, cackling at the climax, it's really sad. And, like, you have old Elizabeth Sparkles. There's a scene where she's this old, haggard witch of the wicked, witch of the forest kind of look to her, and she's running down her own hallway and she trips, and I just went, oh, like, out loud, because it hurt my heart to see her like that. And I think, too, this movie is a lot about loving oneself. Because Elizabeth is a character that is looking for affirmation in everyone around her, and you can't have a satisfying affirmation as a human being without being able to affirm yourself. I mean, your identity, like, this movie is also a lot about identity and how, Elizabeth Sparkles, she's a single lady, she's 50 years old, she has fully, revolved around her career her whole life. She got into the industry early. She struck gold, basically. She's been able to keep afloat. And so I think, too, like, this movie is really about, like, you're more than your career. You're more than a label. You are more than what other people perceive you to be. You have to, inside of yourself, affirm yourself. And I think that's kind of, like, really a lot of where our mental health crisis in this country currently is a lot of people want to put a lot of stock in some label, and that's not gonna fill you. It's not gonna satisfy you. That's not gonna make you confident in yourself, and it's not gonna bring you to a good place ultimately. You have to decide for yourself that you are enough for you, that you are worth it. Like, it's very interesting because there's a man in the movie who says to her in her Elizabeth Sparkle form, and this is the guy who actually handed her the USB chip with the substance information on it. He says to her, it's hard to remember that you're still worthy in this form. And I think that this movie says a lot, I think, in such, well, I say a short amount of time. It's 2 hours, but for what it says, that is a short amount of time. The ideas that it explores and the different themes. I've also heard that this movie, some people have taken it as a reading of what it's like to have a daughter, because Elizabeth Sparkle takes this activator, and then Sue was born, and Sue is the new, young, hip, sexy thing that everyone wants. And so Elizabeth feels like she has given up parts of herself to make Sue, and Sue is, and that is very true. Like, that literally happens in the movie, and I'll explain that in the spoiler section, but she does that for Sue, and Sue goes and is completely like, it's kind of sad, because I guess in a way it could be read as mothers and daughters, but at the same time, Elizabeth says to Sue at one point, you're the only lovable part of me. And so that kind of is where that metaphor breaks apart for me, because I think, like, that's just such a sad reading. Like, if this is a metaphor for mothers having daughters and what that's like, it leaves mothers in a horrible place at the end of the day. And I just don't think that that's what parenthood is supposed to be like, and I just don't think that it is that way. Like, my mom does not feel that way at all. Like, I talked to her about that reading of the film, because I was aware of that when we went to go see it the other week, and she said absolutely not. She does not feel that way. Like, I stole some beautiful, vibrant part of her, like, I am, the only thing lovable left in her, like, that I am her beauty or something crazy like that, which is kind of what that metaphor would lead to if this movie were indeed a metaphor for that. So, anyway, that's a whole hell of a lot in just 9 minutes, so, and that's not even we're not even to the spoilers. So, again, a lot of the purpose of my podcast is to forewarn people. I started off listening to the Dead Meat horror podcast, and that really, and the kill counts, actually. I think it was even before the podcast was, up and running, that I started watching Dead Meat's kill counts, and I think that really helped me be more able to digest a horror movie, which I was very interested in. But unfortunately, I have PTSD from some real life traumas. And so it was hard for me to get into horror until I was able to, like, I think I needed a lot of that telegraphing, or else, you know, like I went and saw Split, and there's a scene in that triggered me. And I had no idea. And so that's what this is kind of about, is hopefully to help you keep tabs on your triggers, and to help you better mentally prepare yourself for whatever you're about to see. Because this movie, you kind of have to be a little bit forewarned, but this is also one of those movies where if you go in thinking you know what's going to happen, you're going to be really disappointed. So don't do that to yourself. Just know that there is nudity, there's medical trauma, there's needles, there's sewing people up. She has to sew back. Sue has to sew up Elizabeth Sparkles at one point. And that there's a lot of blood at the end, if that bothers you. Personally, it's so ridiculous that I can't imagine it would bother you, the amount of blood at the end. Like I said, because it's so ludicrous. And this movie also, it kind of, I could see someone going into this movie theater and crying, you know, just because I know that everybody's in a different place in their life, and this movie probably touched some people in a way that it kind of convicted them, or they felt very like a kindred spirit with Elizabeth Sparkles, because I think a lot of our society is built on vanity, and it's built on outlook and how other people look at you, essentially, and how people perceive you more than how you perceive yourself. And so Elizabeth's world is kind of built on everybody's perception of her versus her own perception of herself. And so when she gets fired, she has to think about these things for kind of the first time. And so that's really tough for her. And I think that's why she turns to the substance. But anyway, if self-image is something you struggle with, you know, this movie deals with it lightheartedly enough. Like, I think one of the Oscars, forgive me if I'm wrong. I heard this secondhand. I haven't checked it for myself because I don't give a shit about the Oscars. But I heard that it is also in a comedy category in the Oscars. And that's because there are many funny moments in this movie, but there's still like a really good deep message, and it still really is mainly a horror. So just be aware of that as well. So getting into more spoiler territory, you have Elizabeth Sparkle right off the get. You see that this movie is not going to adhere to reality because there's snow on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, right? To kind of fast forward a little bit because it is a 2-hour movie. Elizabeth is this big star, reaching 50, used to be a big star. She's kind of hit the peak, and she's peaked. So they fire her, and Dennis Quaid is like, she's too old, blah, blah, blah. And he just wants something young and hot and new. And so Elizabeth goes to the doctor for something. You'll have to forgive me. Can't remember what it was. But as she's there, the nurse kind of examines her spine and says, "You'd be the perfect candidate." And he hands her coat, and inside her coat pocket is this USB card. And so she goes home and eventually looks at what's on this USB, and it's a video ad for the substance. And so it's really funny because she calls and places this order, and she has to, and it's literally like the address to go pick up this order is an alley. And you're like, what? Is that even a real thing? She goes and finds this alley, and it's literally like a gross alley, and there's like graffiti above the door she's supposed to go like in. And so she goes, and she got a little card in the mail, and it opens the door, and the door only opens halfway, so she has to like crouch and get underneath it to get through, because it's a door that doesn't open, it goes up, it rolls like a garage door. And so she goes in, and it's like really gross and grungy until she finds like there's this perfectly white, clean, pristine room, and in it there's different cubbies, and there's only 2 with numbers on them, and one of them she knows is hers. So she goes and she swipes her little card in front of the little reader, and out pops this package. She takes it home, And I think something interesting is that every time Elizabeth goes to get a refill of the chemicals she needs of the substance, she's trying to hide herself more and more. And I think, too, that, like, Demi Moore is an interesting choice for the lead actress in this film because she's had plastic surgery, and she has said, like, that was a really big scandal for her. People were extremely judgmental, and so she works in an industry where beauty is the standard. Like, once you hit 50, you start getting roles where it's like, it's crazy to me because you literally, like, you're in your 40s and your 30s and you're playing characters who are younger, but then you hit 50 and they're like, you should play old women, you should play moms. And so you're like, it's such a strange and huge leap between one side of the spectrum and the other. There's no progression, really. It's like, oh, you hit 50? Yeah, you're not hot anymore, so... And this movie really, like, says that very blatantly. Like, Randy Quaid literally says, once you hit 50, it stops. So... Or Dennis Quaid. I keep saying Randy. I don't know why. Anyway. So... This movie is a lot about this industry. And I think as well, it's about, like, it's very much like Elizabeth Sparkle, the character, but it's also about Elizabeth Sparkle, the idea, and then it's also about women in Hollywood, and it's also about, you know, what if we let the male gaze just run rampant and be the deciding factor on things? Where does that leave women? Because at the end of the day, it's not a great place for women, because we all age. And this movie, you know, it really, you have all these elder men, and especially Mr. Quaid. He is, to me, he's a hot old guy. Like, he's a silver fox. And so he is allowed to age, and he's allowed to be kind of gross and nasty, and it's totally okay. And you're still supposed to crave his attention, or, well, Elizabeth is, and she does. And so it's kind of like, we've created a society, at least in Hollywood, and I think, too, it's starting to permeate, because you see all the time on Twitter and stuff, you know, I follow, like, Am I the Asshole and things like that, and you see all these accounts of people who, in their personal life, a man has only objectified them, or has seen them as not a person, but rather something that he owns and possesses, and it's something that we fought since the beginning of time, right? Like, come on, you look at history and it's been an issue. And this movie just kind of points out why it's an issue. Like, if we allow men to be completely objectifying us, and if we allow them to be the ones who determine how we dress and how we act and our appeal, then we are, at the end of the day, we're kind of shit out of luck. Like, we're thrown away. Once we hit a certain age. I had a friend growing up who, her mom was in her 50s or something, I think, when she met her dad. Her dad was in her 30s, and so her dad had pursued her mom, and her mom was like, no, like, you're gonna get tired of me, like, I'm an old lady, you're not gonna want to be around me for long. And she was gorgeous. Let me just be real honest right here, right now. She was gorgeous, this woman, this friend's mom. And he finally convinced her, and wouldn't you know it, she was right. He ended up leaving her for a younger woman at some point during my friend's childhood. And so this is kind of like, this is what it sets us up for, a male, and this is not like this is a feminist movie, but not in the new feminism way. I think it's very much about the roots of feminism and women being more than our sex appeal. However, this movie, like, it's very satirical, and the tone is very different because it is sad. I mean, it's trying to make a point, so, like, it is sad. Like, Elizabeth eventually is so consumed by her desire to appeal to the masses and appeal to Mr. Quaid that she destroys herself. That's quite literally what happens, because in the movie, if you do not change back after 7 days, the Matrix, who is the original, who is Elizabeth, not her newer, younger, better self, thanks to the substance Sue, so Elizabeth is the one that suffers, and she ages, like, drastically and dramatically, and it's not just, like, aging. It's like she looks like an old witch, like someone who's been through just like hell and back and has never like seen a doctor. Like at one point she grabs under her leg and has to like snap it upward to move her kneecap so she can walk. It's disgusting and horrible, and it makes me want to die. But it's really poignant, and it like really puts a fine point on things, because she's literally ruining herself for this more perfect version of herself, this more sexually appealing version of herself. And where does that leave her at the end of the day? At the end of the day, at the very end of the movie, she thinks, she's like literally so decrepit and old, like it's all prosthetics, and she's flabby, she's gross, her skin has that weird, if you've ever been around old people who are dying, she has like that sheen to her skin. It's horrid. And she calls up the substance, and they're so funny because they're like not any help. They literally tell her, and I think it's so like on the nose, but like in a perfect way, because this movie is satirical, right? They tell her like, there is no she, there is only you, because she's like, Sue won't change back, and she's not doing this, and she's not doing that. And the substance people are like, there is no she, there's just you. You are one and the same. And they say what's done on one side is permanent on the other. And so because of Sue doing all this, because of Sue not changing back, and she just keeps draining the liquid out of Elizabeth's spine rather than switching back and letting it regenerate properly. She just keeps squeezing it out of her. And that's ultimately what makes her like old and decrepit and just like, no one should ever have to live like that. It's horrible. But Elizabeth, once she reaches that point, she then decides she wants to stop. And they're like, the only way you can stop, because there's no going back, there's no fixing it. They're like, you can just stop. We have the termination packet, and it's literally like a liquid that will kill Sue. And so she's like 90% of the way killing Sue. She's got this huge syringe with a ton of liquid in it. She's like 90% of the way done plunging it into her heart, and she says, I can't do it. She says, you are the only lovable part of me. And that is a really like nail on the head right there. And so she tries to switch them. And Sue wakes up at the same time Elizabeth is awake, which is the first time ever, and it's not supposed to happen. And so Sue ends up killing Elizabeth. And because Elizabeth is the original, that does not bode well for Sue. And Sue has like a big gig that night. It's the New Year's Eve special. And so Sue, she goes to work like everything's going to be okay, even though she no longer has any spinal fluid to inject herself with, which means she's gonna fall apart. She does. She starts falling apart. Her teeth start falling out, and then her ears. It's horrible. And then she thinks to herself, well, I have more of that activator left, which I'm just saying, the substance company, like, if you're only supposed to use that shit once and it doesn't take that much, maybe don't give them that much. Don't give them like a whole vial full. Just give them like a little spit, a little drop. Like that's all that was really needed. Holy shit, dude. You could use the activator like 18 more times with how much they put in that little bottle. Anyway, they're setting you up for failure. Anyway, so Sue goes home and decides to hit herself up with that activator because she's like, I'm falling apart, so let's make a more perfect version of me. And instead it creates this monstrosity. And this monstrosity is disgusting, but also it's really fucking funny. And this is the part that like started getting to me as like, it's so ridiculous, but also like really sad, but also ridiculous enough that I can't help but laugh, because she's like got like 3 strands of hair and she tries to curl some of it and with like a curling iron, and it burns off, and she's just like, huh, kind of a thing. And then she is like trying to put her earrings in, and she's got like one ear at like an approximately normal location for an ear, and then the other one is like on the back of her skull, and she just stabs that shit in there, and you're like, oh dear Jesus. And then she goes and takes her big nice photo of herself and cuts out her face and cuts little holes for her eyes and just kind of like tapes this poster photo of Elizabeth Sparkles onto her own face, this monstrosity, and then goes to try and like do the New Year's Eve show. And I think too, this is really like, this is so like, it's so sad, like when you really think about it. Like the director does a really good job, and her name is French, so forgive me, I'm not gonna say it, but mostly because I'm gonna botch it. Her name is, I literally just said I wasn't gonna say it, but I'm gonna try and say it. It's Coralie Fargeat, is what I think is how you're supposed to say it. But Coralie, she has such a, like, this is such a vision of a movie, just because it's so like it makes me want to cry a little bit, but also I can't help but laugh because it's so ludicrous that like, and like my mom, we were watching the movie, and Elizabeth calls up the substance several times to be like, she's doing this and blah blah blah, and the substance people are like, you can stop at any time, and every time she's like, no, you know, I just want her to stop doing this, and they're like, there has to be a balance, like you have to respect the balance. And so at the end of the day, it's because of Elizabeth doesn't respect herself, and that's why this imbalance is created, and that's why Sue allows herself to be taken advantage of, and that's why Sue takes advantage of her own self, and that's why Elizabeth deteriorates, and that's why Sue kills Elizabeth, is because she doesn't respect herself. And so at the end, you have this monstrosity that they literally put up like words that says Monstro Eliza-Sue. And so Eliza-Sue enters the building where the show is going on because she's gonna take the stage, and she imagines that all these people are waiting for her, and they're like, we're so glad you made it, and like, we couldn't do it without you, and they're just applauding her, and it's like really nice. She opens the door though, and no one's there in the hallway, and it's so sad to me. Like, it's such a gut punch. And then she goes on stage, and she can barely speak because she's a monster, unfortunately. And eventually, like, as she's talking, her little taped on mask falls off, and everybody sees the monster, and they call her a monster, and they're screaming and they're yelling, and she's saying like, it's still me, it's still Elizabeth. And they freak out. Some guy comes up and clocks her in the head with a mic stand and blows her fucking head off. It's crazy. And then it grows back. And then her arm, she goes to grab the mic, and her arm falls off. And this is when it gets super ridiculous, because she just starts geysering blood all over the audience. And I'm just laughing my ass off. And I can't stop, because every time I'm about to stop laughing, it cuts to something else in the audience, or it cuts back to Elizabeth just turning in a circle and geysering more blood, and it's just like, oh my god, it's so ridiculous. And it's so funny to me. And then, like, it ends on a shot of Dennis Quaid just covered in blood, and it's the best. And then Elizabeth shambles out of there, and she's walking down the Hollywood Walk of Fame because she has her own star there, and she trips, and it splats, and there's, like, her face had been on the back of, like, Elizabeth Sparkle's face, had been on the back of Monstro Eliza-Sue, and it kind of, like, turns into an amoeba, I guess, and just kind of, like, slides itself to the Elizabeth Sparkle star, and Elizabeth just kind of, like, breathes a sigh of relief, and as she does, she dispels into liquid. And then this is the part that you're like, okay, this movie's like, if you haven't gotten it by now, this movie is not set in reality, because a street sweeper comes by and cleans up that star and sucks up the remnants of Elizabeth, which I've heard many times that whole place smells like piss, so there's no way they have street sweepers doing that shit. But anyway, and that's like the end of the movie, and it's very, like, it's so abrupt and ridiculous. And as we were walking out of the theater, Mom was like, my mom turned to the older couple as we're walking by them, because they were a few seats below us, or a few rows below us, excuse me, and she's like, man, that was something, huh? That was strange. And they were just like, yep, like, and I'm sure, because, like, when I worked at a movie theater, like, I worked at a really small one. It's the world's oldest operating or functionally built movie theater. So basically, it was built to be a movie theater, and it is a movie theater still, and it always has been. So it's literally like the world's oldest movie theater. They just can't call it that because of some legal reason. Can't remember what it was. But anyway, when I worked there, we literally, it's in a smaller town. We only have 2 theaters that operate. So usually we're the only person on shift. And so I had a guy come in to watch some movie, and I can't remember what it was. This was back in 2019. And it was kind of a girly movie, whatever it was. And he goes in and he watches it and he comes out and I go, so did you enjoy it? And he goes, it was what I thought it was. Since it's up for an Oscar, I decided to see it because I always see the movies that are up at the Oscars for certain categories. So I enjoyed it about as well as I thought I would. And I was like, that is some crazy dedication. Like, fuck the Oscars. And I would not be watching every single movie that's up for Best Picture. Like, no way. But some people do that. I suspect that's why these older people were here. And they were in for quite a ride, man. Like, ugh. But, sorry, back to the actual movie, you know? It's so sad and absurd and abrupt. But I think, too, that's kind of like, where do you even go from there? You completely destroy yourself at some point. If you don't lack respect, or if you don't have respect for yourself, if you don't see the value in who you are versus what you are. And that's kind of like, there's a whole scene where Elizabeth is looking in the mirror and she's getting ready for a date. And it's so sad because you know she's not going to go. She's prettying herself up. She's like, you can see she's like ready to go. And as she's walking out, she sees the giant billboard of Sue outside of her high rise. And then she goes back to the bathroom and she takes off some of her makeup and reapplies some of it, or applies more, and it happens several times until finally she just goes into the bathroom, starts wiping all of her makeup off, and it's like very violent. She starts smacking herself in the face, and you can just see like the self-hatred there, and it's so sad. And then she's sitting, you know, the next shot after that is she's sitting in her bedroom in a robe, just kind of sulking in the dark, and her date is texting her, and it's so sad because this guy genuinely, like, I think he genuinely thinks she's beautiful. He genuinely thinks she's lovely. Like, he's very excited for this date, and she can't even go to the date. She can't bring herself to do it because she can't find the value in herself. And that's kind of like, at the end of the day, like, as much of the movie is about like other things, that's also like the main baseline of this movie is what happens if you don't value yourself. It doesn't matter if you're the most successful, the most beautiful, or if you once were, you are still going to destroy yourself at the end of the day. You're still going to loathe yourself. You still would wish to be anybody else. And so I think that's like, I love horror movies with a message, and I love horror movies that say something really important, and I think that this movie says something really important, especially right now, where you have a trend of people who just cannot stand themselves. I mean, like, suicide is on the rise. Like, there's so many people who have so much fear about who they are and the way that that is going to rub up against the world, that instead of creating that friction first and finding out, they've decided to end themselves. And so I just think that this movie is very well timed and also very well done. And again, it's kind of ridiculous. It's definitely not going to be for everybody. Like I said, I was surprised my mom went and saw it. I would not see it with my dad, even though my dad would probably be okay with it. I don't think he would enjoy it, actually. Like, just because he doesn't understand the female gaze. And so this movie is kind of about that anyway. Like, how do females see themselves? And especially when it's like, how do females see themselves in a world that is geared toward the male gaze? But I highly recommend this movie if you've got the stomach for it, if you don't mind ridiculous movies, if you don't mind movies that aren't, like, traditional, because this movie is... even just watching the trailers for it, I was like, okay, I have no idea what that movie's about, but it's a fucking vibe. And this movie is just a vibe. I mean, it's saying everything else, like, it wants to say, but also at the end of the day, it's like, it doesn't adhere to reality. It's vibing. It's doing its own thing. And so I just love that for this film. So if you haven't seen it yet and you're like thinking about it because the Oscars, I would say maybe check yourself a little bit. I enjoyed it very thoroughly, even though, like, medical horror, is kind of like the worst to me. That's genuinely like torture porn, and then also like this medical horror. That's kind of the stuff that I'm like, I don't really need to see that. However, I've heard so much about this movie, and I really wanted to see it. It came back into the theaters because of the Oscars, so I was like, let's give it a go. Fucking loved it. So this is a big recommend from me, again, if you have the right mindset for it and if you can stomach it. But anyway, that's it for today. That's all I'm going to do on the substance. I just shrunk a 2-hour movie into 35 minutes, which is absolutely incredible. Usually it's the opposite. I'll expand a movie from being like an hour into like an hour and a half. But anyway, so there's this. I also have a Buffy the Vampire Slayer podcast that I'm starting to do with a friend of mine. So if you wouldn't mind checking that out, it's currently on Rumble. Just go to Rumble, type in When Logic Dies. That's all one word. And then Buffy, and that's the first episode. Unfortunately, my recording equipment did not record it. So even though it said it was recording, I was pretty upset about that. Hopefully the next one I will be able to get. But other than that, check me out on Rumble, Beware the Moon Pod. I do gaming streams over there. I also do these podcasts over there and here on YouTube, and or here on Rumble and over on YouTube as well. So if you're listening on Rumble, check out my YouTube, Beware the Moon Pod. Hopefully soon I will be doing another horror book review. I not recently, but I did Gone to See the River Man by Christopher Triana. I just got Along the River of Flesh from him, so be looking forward to that. For some reason, that's one of my more popular podcast episodes. Probably because I go through the book kind of beat by beat. But anyway, thank you guys very much for listening. Hope you're having a lovely start to your year, and I will see you next time.